something about being online just gave people license to speak out and freak out in ways that sitting before one another, they wouldn't have dared say such absolute and like black and white, the black and white thinking involved, the lack of grace for one another, the way in which the word love became a problem, because for many, love sounded like accommodation. And it was like, that bad behavior needs to end. Don't talk to me about loving each other. You're talking about accommodating beliefs that have to go. So I think tolerance, as fraught as that word is, time. And if I don't have the confidence to say something to somebody's face, should I really put it in an email? Maybe not.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Our show is powered by you, the listener. If you want to support the work that we do, get early access to episodes, episode guides, and more, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture to become a monthly patron so that we can continue in this important work. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. Thank you so much. You know what else would help us out? Share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network. Tell them how much you enjoy it and let them know that they should be listening as well. If you are new here, welcome. If you want to dig deeper, find us on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast, where I post video clips and quotes and interact with all of you. Previous guests on the show have included Sarah Bessey, Karen Swallow Pryor, and Elizabeth Oldfield. You can go back, listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Eliza Griswold. Eliza Griswold is the author of 6 books of poetry and nonfiction, all published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. Her forthcoming book is Circle of Hope, A Reckoning with Love, Power, and Justice in an American Church, which is out on August 6th. Her book, Amity and Prosperity, One Family and the Fracturing of America, was awarded the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction. She writes for The New Yorker, is the Ferris Professor and Director of the Program in Journalism at Princeton University. I am so excited to have Eliza on the podcast. She is one of the most insightful and astute writers that I have read. Her new book, Circle of Hope, is definitely one of my favorite books I have read this year. In this conversation, Eliza Griswold provides a fascinating look into her book, Circle of Hope, which chronicles the experiences of a progressive evangelical church in Philadelphia as they navigate major cultural shifts and challenges in 2020 and beyond. Griswold discusses how she was drawn to explore this particular church community. She wanted to represent a different perspective on evangelicalism compared to the dominant narratives. We delve into the tensions and conflicts that arise within the church as they grappled with issues of race and justice and the role of faith in addressing systemic problems. Eliza offers insights into how the rapid pace of change and the online environment contributed to the breakdown of trust and empathy within the congregation. Ultimately, we highlight the complexities involved in trying to enact meaningful cultural and ideological change within a religious institution, and the importance of embodied experiences and restraint in navigating divisive issues. We not only talk about what's going on in the church, we talk about the wider culture in America as well. Eliza's book and this discussion provide a nuanced look at the challenges facing churches and communities as they strive to live out their values in a polarized world. Here is my conversation with Eliza Griswold. Eliza, welcome to Shifting Culture. So excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about your book, Circle of Hope. I don't think you need any more affirmation, but this is a brilliant work of writing, immersion journalism. Like, it's brilliant. And I absolutely love it. And I think it should be studied in universities, especially in seminaries, as they're looking at churches and culture and transition, whole bunch of things. So I just want everybody to read this book. So well done. Good job.
I mean, I can't tell you how much that means. No, I can take all. This is not out yet. I'm like, this is the hardest time. I'm like, not at all sure of it. So I'm so grateful for each of those things. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So I want to jump in. So, man, this is a long process for you to immerse yourself into a place and to write the story of it and write as you were going. What made you look at the church Circle of Hope in Philadelphia and say, hey, this is probably my next project. This is where I want to immerse myself. What were you hoping for?
I was hoping to broaden and deepen our narrative about evangelicals in the American religious landscape, right? Because, the truth is we hear so much about conservative evangelicals and the rise of white Christian nationalism, all of which is really important. But that's not a complete picture of who these devout and ardent believers are. And I felt really compelled to look at that broader picture and try to bring that to readers who both knew what churches look like and people outside of them entirely.
Yeah. So then what was a little different with Circle of Hope?
So Circle of Hope is a little different in several key ways. I first saw these guys. I was out in Philadelphia in one of the neighborhoods hit hardest by opioids. And I was out with a young evangelical who's really like a leader of this progressive movement. And his name is Shane Claiborne. And he was, at that time, as he still is, he was melting guns into garden implements to live out the biblical injunction to beat swords into plowshares. So he was on the corner with his mobile forge, poking an AK-47 barrel into the flames. And behind him, I knew exactly what I was looking at, that I was looking at a group of these earnest young Jesus followers who many of whom had left megachurches, and they left the conservative rural childhood faith that they'd been grown up in, but they had not left Jesus behind. And you could tell they're heavily tattooed, in some cases pierced, but they're wearing thrift store chic, pretty well pressed. There's an earnestness to them that really said to me, this is who I'm looking for. This is this kind of group of young believers who I want to follow for as long as I can.
That's helpful for people to start to get a different perspective. And then as you started to immerse yourself, what were you seeing? And because you're getting into this place, a lot happens when you are there. And particularly, 2020 happens. That's probably a big cultural moment. Not only is there a pandemic, but there's all sort of awareness of racism within the church in the United States, systemic racism. There's a lot of cultural touchstones that people were trying to navigate. While I was reading your book, I was like, I want this pastor to read it. I need somebody else to read it. But I was like, they might just be re-traumatized through everything that they went through at the same time. It was pretty phenomenal that you got to walk through a period of history like that with this church. What were you seeing as the difference? Because while you were there was a transition between the founders with the whites and the four pastors with four different congregations in Circle of Hope. What were you seeing with the different transition of this younger generation coming up and the older generation passing the torch?
So what I saw basically in 2020 with the crucible, the cultural crucibles that we all pass through, whether these reckonings over race, gender, going online, all our relationships were disrupted in every way you can imagine. And some of my friends, some friends who've read this book who are in church really said what you do, which is this is a book about pastor burnout and what we put our pastors through in this day and age. They're not paid enough. They do the work of a social worker, a cruise director, they need to know the tech. It is too much. So there's a huge piece here that is, I do think, is for pastoral education, right? Like, because it's hard as anything. There's also a piece for people who don't have much to do with church, because those of us who live in communities and institutions are pretty familiar with a lot of what these guys go through. So what happens, in broad strokes, is that pandemic starts, they argue whether they should go online or not, right? Because they are an embodied community. They believe strongly about being together in physical place. They don't like megachurch, high production value church. They're always against that. So to be asked to participate in that is really challenging, but they do go online. And then the real bump and reckoning that really comes to bear upon them is the murder of George Floyd, and how that causes them to go from a mostly white church committed to social justice and kind of doing good work in the challenged and underserved communities around them, to looking within at what their own systems hold. And that is the tricky reckoning that ultimately brings the church into crisis.
Yeah. And there's a big crisis. I think part of that, I mean, you're looking at huge culture shift and change when everybody is going through a traumatic experience. It looked like to me like they were trying to change the church like overnight. It was a very quick transition. And I know that talking to, people within, culture systems, they think that it takes about 5 to 7 years to really shift a culture to something new. And it seems like this was really fast. What did you observe, or what were you seeing with a quick culture transition like they were trying to do?
The quickness is definitely part of what brought them into conflict with one another, and the disembodied nature of it. Like, one of the people I respect a lot, like, talked about like being internet brave, right? And we saw that certainly outside of church, like whipping off the quick email, getting into fights on Facebook, all of these things that happen way outside of churches also really, really destroyed the fabric of trust among these guys. And the thing that made it different than working at, say, the Audubon Society, which also came under one of these reckonings, is that at Circle of Hope, many of the members had this is their chosen family. This is how they followed Jesus. Like, this is the core tenets of how they gave their lives to make meaning of their lives. And many of them had left childhood churches where they didn't hold their parents. They had separated from their parents, largely Republican politics. They wanted to do church in a different way. And so for that reason, the speed with which they tried to change their culture and root out evil, I mean, that is what they were trying to do, root out the evil of whiteness among them, it had the fervor and kind of utopianism that was at the heart of the project of Circle of Hope. But with that fervor, a lot of people got hurt in ways probably, I've had lots of people who are inside the church read the book and say the thing that's so painful for them to take away is how close to one another they actually were, and how at the time they felt so far apart. They were absolutely right. This other person was absolutely wrong. And now with just a few years of hindsight and reading the interior life of somebody else, they can see they had much more in common than they didn't. And I think that is pretty devastating.
So then, because this is a microcosm of what was happening in the wider culture surrounding us, what is the embodied experience? What's the necessary component for us in culture to have embodied experience with each other so that we know that there is more in common with one another than we thought?
Well, that's such a great question. I would say the first lesson is practicing restraint, restraint of the send button, restraint of, because what happened is that the frustrations and anxieties that so many people were feeling, something about being online just gave people license to speak out and freak out in ways that sitting before one another, they wouldn't have dared say such absolute and like black and white, the black and white thinking involved, the lack of grace for one another, the way in which the word love became a problem, because for many, love sounded like accommodation. And it was like, that bad behavior needs to end. Don't talk to me about loving each other. You're talking about accommodating beliefs that have to go. So I think tolerance, as fraught as that word is, time. And if I don't have the confidence to say something to somebody's face, should I really put it in an email? Maybe not.
Yeah. I agree. That's good. One of the things that Gwen White said to you as everything was falling apart, as there were arguments that were happening, and there's infighting that they're saying, your whiteness is a problem. She had this little phrase. She said, powers and principalities to you. And she was invoking like, hey, they're being controlled a little bit by powers and principalities. My understanding when we're coming to Ephesians 6 or whatever with the principalities, really the ideologies that we hold actually holds more power than Jesus does when we're captivated by ideology. When you were observing them, it felt like the shift was, to me, as I was reading it, Jesus was centered and justice really revolved around the ways of Jesus, into the ideology was centered, and we wanted to make sure that the idea of anti-racism or whatever gender, whatever it was, they wanted that to be centered and make sure that that is okay. And Jesus was like on the side over here. Was that an accurate observation as I was reading? Or what is that? I'm just trying to figure out how are we captivated by these ideologies and how that steers us wrong.
So I would say what you just said is absolutely in line with what many of the sort of like longer term members of Circle would say, right? So there is, you had mentioned this generational tension. So there really is a generational tension at the heart of this book between, people who come out of the Jesus freak movement, right? So, they come out of this utopian idea of like building the kingdom of heaven on earth, and they are very suspicious of worldly institution, right? And that's, there you go, powers and principalities. Like, if it is not of Jesus, it has no place in the church. That's the way that argument goes. Just a note on how the story is told. I don't write this anywhere in the book, but it's told from the 4 current pastors' points of view. So instead of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you've got Ben, Johnny, Rachel, and Julie, right, telling this story from. So the point of view that you are reflecting is absolutely Ben, the son of the founder, who's one of the pastors. He would say that to this day, that really watch. Like one person says to me, I don't want to go to the Church of Black Lives Matter. I want to go to Church for Jesus. Not that like the Black Lives Matter has a place of its own, but it's not the church, right? So those questions, and that person is one of the people I know who's most dedicated to living anti-racism every day. So that lots of those questions are exactly at the heart of the book. But there are these younger people in the church who would say that that very idea isn't, that Jesus is only in justice. And when I can hear people starting this argument, and they often retell Jesus flipping the tables in the temple. When somebody talks about flipping those tables, Jesus didn't just preach peace. He flipped the money changers' tables. That is a call to this invigorated activism that sees Jesus as Jesus is a warrior. It's not a convenient, it's not white Christian nationalism, but it's another vision that Jesus is here to fight for the least of these, that Jesus is here to fight for the marginal, and that he fought the Roman Empire. And that is a different vision of the church. And I think both have, they the tension between them is interesting to me, and watching people live that was very interesting.
It is an interesting tension. I just think that there's so much fighting today. There's fighting in the church. There's fighting in culture. There's fighting everywhere. And so we talked about embodied experience helps. And then how about this? Like, what is it to center the marginalized? If it's not a fight stance, but it is we could actually help uncover our own biases that we have, the lenses that we see culture through. Is there a way where it doesn't devolve into chaos, but in a way we can start to analyze our own culture, our own bias, and say we can center the marginalized without having like this fight stance? All Nations Kansas City has 2 exciting events with Jamie and Donna Winship coming up. Join us on September 13th for our annual fundraiser, Further Together, with Jamie and Donna as our main speakers. Did you know that God is on the move all around the world? You will hear stories about people receiving their true identity from God and impacting nations. And you will be invited to join us so that more stories like these can happen and we can see peace in the midst of conflict. The following day, September 14th, Jamie and Donna will be doing their identity exchange workshop. Join us to discover your true identity and experience a life of joy, peace, and freedom. You can register for both events at allnations.us.
I think so. I think so. I think there's not just one answer to that, right? I think I can almost basically, so what I hear when you ask that is I hear everybody's response in the book. So what I with my head, right, I'm not, and that is one thing as a journalist, like people do say to me often, well, I wish I knew more what you thought, that it's really like, and I'm like, but that's not what I'm doing, right? Because I'm not a member of this church. I'm not deeply steeped in these teachings. Like, so what I think from the outside isn't really relevant, This is a question inside of Christianity of how is it going to remain relevant? If Jesus' teachings don't have practical application to today, so, and then how do you apply them? And with how much force is it necessary to apply them? And, even seeing the binary, like, is the binary itself a problem between saved and damned at the heart of evangelicalism? And I would say that is, for me, where I can say my opinion there is I think that's any religion that puts some people in a box of saved and others in a box of not saved is going to be a problem because you're setting up a binary.
Then does that actually inform your writing? So that opinion right there, if you're setting up binaries, are you not trying to set up binaries in your writing? What are you trying to do when you are observing something for the long term? And how do you get into it as a journalist? What is your aim as you're writing it? And how do you not have your own biases play out into your writing?
Totally. So to start with the last part of that, my biases most definitely play out in writing, and my job is to know what they are, to be as self-aware as possible, and to own them when they come up, right? So my own context here is that, because I grew up as a pastor's kid in the Episcopal Church, I didn't hit a kind of, in that church, in that sort of mainstream Protestant church, and certainly the way that it was practiced in my house, there was no idea that being a Christian was any more like closer to God than being a Muslim or being Jewish. There was nothing like that. It happened to be the teaching in which I was raised, right? But at point, so when I became old enough, really after 9/11 as a reporter and started reporting inside of evangelicalism, it baffled me to see a kind of Christianity that posited from the jump that these guys knew better and were saved, and others were not, right? You may love them. Of course, you love everybody, but some of them are in hell, right? So that, I have been curious about that. And I think that curiosity is part of what drives my interest in evangelicalism. And I think where I found that I had questions about what Circle of Hope was up to is where they still, although they claim not to hold these teachings, and some people did not, they did not hold the beliefs of like exceptionalism or exclusive salvation. That idea of being better than, wiser than, animated part of the church. And when I could see that at play, that I knew was a problem. I knew that was a problem and that needed to be interrogated. Now, as working as a journalist, my job was to get inside as much as possible the experience of these four pastors and to set their experiences and ideas on the page as accurately as I could, knowing full well that I wasn't those people and I could only do as well as I could do.
Yeah. I think that, you did a fantastic job, but as you're helping see things through different perspectives, the shift of this church, I think, is really helpful in not just evangelicalism. It's not just about evangelicalism. I think it's about the culture of America at the moment. It really is like we really see it.
And it has to be. That's what I hope that people take away from the book. And I do want to, it is about the culture of America now.
Yeah. Yeah. So then we have people thinking about exceptionalism, like we are exceptional, we are better than others. And we're seeing this play out, especially in politics at the moment, like this presidential election. It's all about I'm better, you're better. We're in different camps. Like, is there, as an observer, you're an observer, a journalist, do you think with your years from post 9/11 through today, is there hope for a different type of America moving forward than two camps warring and fighting with one another, thinking they're better than each other?
I think what we're coming to, I think what has become so divisive and violent now that we may come to an end to is this idea that I am better by nature of what I believe, right? My beliefs make me better. That's relatively new, and like I did not, and I get asked questions as a journalist, well, how can you talk to those people? You know what they believe? And that, I get those questions mostly from people on the left when I go out and talk to people on the right. Well, why are you centering that voice? Why are you talking to somebody who holds those beliefs? And that makes me uneasy because I don't believe that people are better or worse by nature of their beliefs. And I do not believe, of course, there are people who don't deserve the time and who exposing the nature of their ideology, engenders violence. But that is a pretty extreme claim. I think we're burning out on that. And I also, by virtue, I've been out, since the Trump assassination attempt, I've been out in Pennsylvania, reporting on his followers and now doing some work on not his followers. And I think people are so sick and tired of these two parties. And I think the skepticism of institutions and the idea that these parties are not aligned anymore with what people believe and that they're both kind of captured by corporations. I hear conspiracy theory both on the right and the left. And I also hear a real yearning for a broader political spectrum that makes me think that this kind of binary, like once we're in a dialectic of any kind, of black and white and us versus them, that's inherently violent. Because if it's us versus them, we're in trouble.
Yeah, we are. And I think there is some hope that we could actually move together. We could have this embodied experience. We could have, as you were growing up, I think the table, is a wonderful place of acceptance of all people, and we could talk across differences. I love it. I just want to say thank you for even just putting your story, your father, in the beginning and the end of this book. I thought it was beautiful. Just his heart in the midst of 2003 of what he was going through as the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. My wife was at an Episcopal seminary during that time, so she knew everything that was happening there, and so that was a very difficult time. And then the death of your father at the end, and the beautiful thing you said at the end is, to love is to grieve. And I think one of the things is people are loving Circle of Hope, this church, and there's also a lot of grief in the midst of it. You and your story, and so I just want to say thank you for that, because it was a beautiful part that was just endeared me to you, and you're writing your story. And so it was just beautiful. And I thought it actually brought in a lot of incredible color to the story of loving in the midst of this church and the grief that they were going through as they were fighting and trying to find justice and love for all people, fighting for inclusion of all people as we're moving forward. And so we only have a couple minutes, so I want to say, where can people find Circle of Hope? Where would you like to point people to? Any of your other writings or things that you want to point people to?
Oh, well, thank you. Okay. So where can people find Circle of Hope? Like, hopefully in your local bookstore, and certainly online, at Macmillan or Amazon or, wherever. You just Google it, Circle of Hope, you should be able to find it. And that is one thing. If you're looking for Circle of Hope as a congregation, you might have a harder time, but I'm not going to say more about that because I want you to read the book. And my other writings, I write for the New Yorker. I'm a contributing writer for the New Yorker, so I'm out there really on the beat these days before the election, and I'm just about to start at Princeton as the director of their journalism program. So if you want to find me in an embodied experience, you can come to the coffee shops of Princeton, New Jersey, and that is where I will be.
Awesome. That's good. I just want to point people to, I think, one of your writings in the New Yorker that I loved recently was your article about the little Palestinian girl who lost her leg. Such a heartbreaking and beautiful story. Man, thank you for that. Like, that got me. I lived in the Middle East for 5 years, and we're hanging out with Syrian refugees for that whole time. And man, that was just, that got me. And so thank you for that. It was a beautiful, beautiful story. And I know it's a harrowing story too. And it's hard. So I also pray that you have people that you could go to, that you could talk through some of your trauma as you've been talking about other people's traumas. And so, yeah, it was great. So I want to point people to that story as well, because that was a great, great article.
Thank you so much. And I think those kids from Gaza, they're now 11,000 child amputees. And I'm going to be spending some more time with them over the coming years. So thank you for calling that one out.
That's good. Well, Eliza, thank you for this conversation. Really, really loved having you on. I'm so thankful that this happened. So blessings on your book. I pray that it's very successful and many people go out and read it. So thank you
so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, You will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.